My name is Dave Vance. We'll be talking, this is the first in the series of exploring group project administration. We'll be talking about subgroups, how to organize and group members. Have about 30 minutes of that presentation, and then we'll follow up after the recording with some Q&A. So I just went over that. So let's jump in. And I haven't timed myself on this, so we'll try to make it 30 minutes and we'll see how well we do. I said there was 3 topics when I put this out on social media. I actually expanded it to 4. I'll talk first about common ways of organizing subgroups, just how you know, if you're starting a project or if you're reorganizing one, what do you think about? How do you put the subgroups in order? Then how do you find the right subgroup for a new kit? If a new kit comes in, how do you know where to place that in your subgroup organization? Some actual ways, the mechanics of actually moving a kit into a new subgroup. Everybody knows about the obvious one, but there's a secondary way of doing it that I'll share that's maybe a little bit easier if you're going to be moving multiple people. And then a bit of a special topic, but sometimes you get a kit that comes in that matches one of your subgroups, but you're not really sure. It's not of your surname. You're not really sure if it connects within the time frame that that subgroup's been around. So is it convergence or is it actually a match? And you can't tell for sure, but I'll give you some ideas of ways that you can know whether it's likely or not that they're either convergence or a real match. So then let's move on to, wait a minute, give me a second. There we go. We can move on to, of course, what I mean is the groupings of the project are these colored lines, right? They're the ways that the project has been set up. If you're a new administrator, this may not be perfectly obvious, but every project has an organization to it that the members get sorted into, even if it's only ungrouped and one large group that holds everything else. Every project has a default grouping, and the project administrator, of course, can organize that in the right way to make sense to their own project. And we'll talk a little bit about what kinds of things you want to do to make that easier for you as the administrator and easier for your members. And of course, the way that you organize it is under the gap function, right? The administrators sign on the FTDNA system. You go into project admin, there's a thing called member subgrouping. You get the screen that I show here. You're going to click on the create subgroup button in order to create a subgroup. And then over on the right-hand side, there's places to delete them or change the colors and do different things for them. So that's how you create and manage the structure, the basic structure. That's also where you go to sort the members into subgroups, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The same general idea, I'll say not the tool, but the same general idea applies if you're doing a project either manually or if you're using the WIFO group project and so on. This isn't just a family tree DNA topic. If you do any group analysis, if you're managing a surname project, even in a spreadsheet, you're going to be doing something similar in terms of organizing your members and organizing the data that you get out of testing. So all of these ideas are applicable to any way you're going to manage a group of related people, especially when they break into smaller clusters of subgroups. But of course, we're going to be talking a lot about the family tree DNA interface that the group administrators use, because that's one of the most common ways that people do that exercise, right? So normally, I'll say what I see the most often, what probably is the most common. I'm not going to use the term best practice because, again, everybody's project's different, everybody's groups are different, everybody has a different approach to this, and the purpose of your project really drives how you're going to organize it. But surname projects are pretty common. The other types, of course, if you're talking about haplogroup projects, are almost always organized by the haplogroups and the haplotree for that area, right? So they break down into the haplotree branches. If you're doing a geographical project, it could be arranged by geography if there's, sub-geographies, but it usually also breaks into haplogroup projects, sometimes by surname, if that's how they do it, but generally eventually into a smaller haplogroup level. Surname projects, again, if you're not talking about a very special purpose surname project, a general surname project will break into usually a grouping that's based on both haplogroups and genealogy info. So you get this one-to-one mapping to say, well, and the example I've got over here says, okay, well, the descendants of John Smith all happen to fall into, and I just made these haplogroups up. So if you look on the haplotree, you won't find these, but they fall into R1B. BY6612 is the SNP that defines the haplogroup that they fall into. So that's the descendants of John Smith. There's a son of his called Matthew Smith that's under FTA 662, and I created group 1.10 and 1.11 for that. And so it's a combination of the haplogroups that they're under and the genealogy info. Now, I particularly like to put both of those in the subgroup names, because it helps my members see, where they fall. My members never remember that they're group 1, group 5, group 7, whatever. They never remember that. They remember they're the descendant of, let's say, John Smith, right? So they'll go in here and they'll look at it and go, where am I again? Oh, yeah, that's right. I'm a descendant of Zachariah Smith. Okay, that's where I am. Fine. Or they might remember that they're IZ2993 if they're particularly into the SNPs and the haplogroups and so on. And so they'll remember that and they'll go looking for that. So, and it's a way that they can remind themselves of that too. Also, when someone new comes to look for my surname project and say, hey, should I join this project? Is there anybody else that if I tested, I might fall into their group? They look at this and go, oh, well, I'm a descendant of this man, so I'll fall into that group. And they know that by default. It's a little bit of advertising for me to tell people that I have a wide set of surname origins that are already represented in the group. It's not just lineage A, B, C, and D, and they don't know what that means, right? The thing on the right here just says, look, you can do any numbering scheme you want. Some people do group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Some add a second tier, so they might have a group 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, and so on. A lot of people do the group 1.11, 1.12, 1.13, 2.10, and so on. You can be as complicated as you want. I'll go through some ideas I have on things you should consider when you're coming up with that scheme, but and I will get to questions and things at the end. So thank you for putting them in the chat. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in there. I will cover those at the end as part of the recording, so thank you for those as well. But the basic idea in a generic surname project is that the subgroups really reflect clusters of members who descend from one most recent common ancestor within, I'll say, genealogical time, right? Maybe the last 1,000, 1,500 years. It doesn't always have to be within the time of records. It doesn't even have to be within the time that where that group connects to. Very often our groups connect to a member that has not been identified yet, but the idea being that you have a chance of finding out who that common ancestor was, at least, and that group is more tightly connected to each other than they are to anyone else in your project. For example, now this is a complicated chart, but my Vance project, the way I created this chart over on the far left is the ancient history. So that's where the haplogroups start to split up. You'll see R, G, I, and E on that chart for many thousands of years ago, going all the way to present day on the right-hand side, where all of my subgroups fall in. I have 18 subgroups in the project. They're all obviously a very widely spread different haplogroups. I have a lot in R, I have some in G, I have some in I have some in E. I think I actually have one in E, but anyway, all this does is it says where they all, how far back is the common ancestor of all of these? Well, that's 66,000+ years ago. And then as you get closer to present day, the branches start splitting. So it's a representation of the haplotree that's very specific to my projects. But the reason that I have it here is just to show that my subgroups are all essentially smaller groups that connect back in more recent time periods that are branches off of the major set of branches of the haplotree. So again, depending on your surname, on your project's purpose, you're going to do this differently, but a lot of them end up being very similar to this. There's variations that are pretty common. Sometimes people put the level of testing in the name, or they split the subgroup. Here I've made a 1.10a and a 1.10b just for example, that said the first one are all the descendants of John Smith that are confirmed by big Y testing. The second ones are the likely ones, but they're only STR tested, so we're not sure yet. The second example says you split it based on traditional genealogy knowledge. I know the people in the first group are solid genealogy back to Zachariah Smith. The others are likely, but they connect to a more recent common ancestor, and I haven't proven that common ancestor connects back to Zachariah yet, but I know that it's pretty likely that he does, and so there are some variations that you can adopt to make this a little more complicated. And then you can put other information into the names too, right? This other example I have is here I've said, well, for group 110, it's recommended that they all upgrade to big Y. For group 2.10, they actually only have to upgrade to Y67 because I get a pretty good idea in those STRs as to where they fall, and I've got good genealogy knowledge. I can slot these people in. Yeah, so whatever your project representation is drives the advice that you're going to give to each of these subgroups as to what they should upgrade to. A lot of people just want everybody to upgrade to big Y, and that's fine. But if you have a difference there by subgroup, you can put it in there so your members know that you're recommending that. You don't have to put it there. You can put it somewhere else too. And I'm going pretty fast just to get everything in for this period, but hopefully if you want to go back over it, you can look at the recording. But the points to consider about how you organize your surname project, usually simpler is better. Keep the number of subgroups stable, and by which I mean when you get new members added in, you don't want to have to go back and change all your subgroups. And manageable. You want to be able to not only manage it yourself and not have too much complexity about how you manage the project, but be able to explain it to your members as well and have them understand why you created that structure. I have 18, and that's a lot, but we have a varied origin. With a surname like Smith, you're going to have hundreds. With a surname like Wojciechowski, you're probably only going to have 2 or 3. So it very much depends on what the background of the group that you're managing really is. And all of that drives, again, both the complexity and how you're going to set up your project. Depends on what clusters of members you're going to analyze together. Remember, I said that these subgroups are usually the clusters that come down from the older haplogroups and form a group that's related within a genealogical time frame. If that's how you're going to organize your members, that's how you're going to analyze them. You're going to tell your members, that they all fit into that group, that they descend from that common ancestor, whatever. If your focus is more on the 6 brothers of John Smith, maybe you want to split it up by the 6 brothers and analyze those separately. Maybe that's the groups that you're going to communicate to your members and talk about, well, for the ones that are the descendants of William Smith, that here's how I'm going to do that kind of thing, right? So maybe that's how you organize your subgroup. There's nothing wrong with that. Again, the other point is, how are you going to organize your communications back to your members? If the important thing for them to know is what son of John Smith they descend from, that may be the right way to do your subcluster. Also, you want to think about, do you want the subgroup organization to attract prospective members? This means that you have your DNA results public. And again, as I said before, you're going to want to have people who think they might want to join the project go there and look at it and say, oh, I'm descended from these people. I'm in this group, so I'm going to match all these people. If I test, maybe I should go join this. Obviously, if they've already tested, then they may already know that they match the project. But if they go into the project and they look at it without contacting you first, that gives them at least an idea that they will be able to find a place in the project if they join, and a reason to contact you. So even if they don't contact you, at least you're advertising in a way that this is a good place to come be, right? Then the other thing to think about is, how are you going to handle NPEs, MPEs, depending on what version of that you want to use. You want to either keep them in the same subgroup as the members that they're a branch off of, or you want to split them off into their own subgroup, or in some cases, the admins don't want them in the projects, which I like to keep them because I think any branch that's related closely, even if they're a different Y-DNA line, their genealogical knowledge may help me. So I think that's important. But anyway, that's also depends on how you do it. So the things that I personally say you should avoid. Now, I'll say that very deliberately. I say you should avoid them. It doesn't mean your project isn't a type or an environment where this is important, right? I don't like the ones that say that have generic subgroup names. So you have things that say lineage 1, lineage 2, lineage 3, or family groups 1, 2, and 3, or even by haplogroup, haplogroup R, haplogroup I, haplogroup J. I don't like it because it doesn't tell me as an outsider what that represents. Is that the sons of John Vance? Is that what group is that? And if I come into your project and just look at it from the outside, I don't know who's who in that project. Now, that may be your intent. If your project is secretive, if you don't like to have that information get out, if it's If it's a problem for your members and they've asked you not to release it and so on, maybe that's what you're trying to do, and that's fine. That I'm just saying my personal preference is not to do that. I don't like, and I put a joke on this slide, of course, I've organized a project by the Noble line and then all the other scum. You don't normally want to tell your members that one group is the important group and everybody else is, gee, it's a shame you don't belong to that group, right? That's not the point of a project group either. But, and I'm not going to go that far and say you should do that, but for instance, if your project was created specifically to analyze the descendants of a particular person, so you're not handling all the Smiths, you're only handling the descendants of John Smith, then maybe you actually do have a group that's the descendants of John Smith and a group that's a holding group for other people who have joined but turned out not to descend from them, and they belong maybe in the general Smith project but not in yours. Okay, well, that's all right. You just want to be careful not to give that impression to all of your members that you don't like most of them, you only like the ones that are in certain groups, right? So the flavor of that is important. And then the other one that I usually say is don't only organize. It's fine to put an organization that says, here's people who have tested Big Y, here's people who haven't in some cases, but you don't want to organize your entire project that way and have people who are tested Y12, 37, 67, and Big Y, for instance, because that would lump a bunch of people who are in different clusters who happen to have tested at the same level, but who don't really descend from a common ancestor together. And that'll make it a lot harder for you to analyze. So that gets back to the point of do it the way that makes sense to you to analyze the project, right? So I usually recommend having a limited number of general categories. Now, everybody gets the ungrouped, right? That's where all of your initial testers who join the project land. They fall into ungroup. And what I said at the bottom here is a lot of project admins like to keep the ungrouped category empty so that when a new joiner comes in, because if they've turned on automatic joining, those people will show up automatically and the admin gets an email, but they don't know that they've come in otherwise. But if you look there, you'll see people that you haven't categorized yet and you haven't moved out. So it gives the admin a good way to know what their workload is there in order to analyze those people and to move them out. Some people use it differently, that's fine. I tend to leave it empty other than the new people who have joined. But I do have three other categories that I use. If you have others, that's great. One is the no matches, which means a new tester's come in, might be of my surname, but doesn't match anybody else in the project and doesn't match anybody else either. They're of a line that hasn't been tested. They don't have any matches or none that make sense to understand their origins. I don't create a whole new subgroup for them only because I would proliferate a lot of different subgroups. I put them in a general category that says, hey, as soon as we know more information about your line, we'll definitely move you to the right place, which probably is going to mean creating a new subgroup for them. But I don't have any data to do that yet. I don't know where they're from. I don't know their background. Presumably they don't either, or I would have more information. But so those are the folks that we really need to get more testers and understand more about their backgrounds before we can start to sort them into the project. There are a lot of people in my project. Again, this depends on how you manage your project, but there's a lot of people in my project who are only connected by autosomal lines, or they're not connected, but they have a reason to be part of the project to see how it's going and to get the data and so on. And we've let them in. Now that's decision on the admin's part as to who do you want to join your project. Sometimes people only want the people who have Y-DNA tested and who match. That's fine. I let autosomal connectors come in and follow the project. So I have a whole category of if they've tested, by the way, but I know they'll never match one of my groups and they're not Y-DNA connected to my lines, I'm going to put them into this group because they can stay in the project, but I'm not going to analyze them and I'm not going to group them. And then I do have a few. I mean, I said you really shouldn't organize the groupings based on the level of testing, but I do have an exception. I have a few people who tested very early on. They only have Y12 tests. I can tell they're one of probably one or two subgroups, but they had no genealogical information, so I can't tell where they fall really. I can't sort them. And unfortunately, most of them have passed away or they're not responding to email. So I can't do anything with them. I'll put them in a separate group and say, hey, I'd love to sort these people. I think I know, I think they might belong to two or three of these groups, but I can't tell which one until they upgrade. So that's where I do have, I don't know, 4 or 5 members of my group of my project who are in that category. And I'm just waiting to hopefully find someone or a son or a cousin or somebody that can contact me and say, hey, look, I can upgrade, let's go do that, right? So, but so I have a couple of general categories. I would say minimize those because you don't want to have a catch-all category that ends up filling up with a lot of people, but you can do that. Okay, now you get a new tester comes along and joins your project. Let's say they're of the surname, so you know they probably match somebody. How do you figure out who they match? How do you figure out what subgroup to assign them to? And let's pretend for a minute that they will match, one of your existing subgroups, and you have to find out which one. The easiest way is probably if they've given you at least limited authority to their kit, as soon as they join the project, to open up their kit, their account information, go into their kit and take a look at their YSTR matches or their big Y matches if they have them, and see who they match, right? So if they match John Smith, Zechariah Smith, and Henry Smith, who have all tested, you go look and see, well, John Smith, Zechariah Smith, and Henry Smith are all in my group 2.10. Great. Well, this person probably belongs there too. Now, if you happen to see that they have, in a very rare case, if you have subgroups that are very closely connected, you might get matches to more than one subgroup. I would think that's unusual, but it could happen. So you might have to do another level of detail to take a look at, where they fall. At least for me, I've found so far that just looking at their matches is enough for me to immediately tell what subgroup they belong to. If you don't have that option, you can run a number of tools, and I will post those right here. Give me a quick second. The tools for sorting them into haplogroup, I've got 4 or 5 here that you can use. There we go. This to everybody. And so here's some links to a bunch of different tools. So just in no particular order, the McGee utility is an older tool, but still works just fine. You put a bunch of STRs in, and it'll tell you how closely they're each related to each other, so you can find the groups from that. There's a good tool by Hunter Proven that looks for STR matches. There's a Chase Athlete tool that's been around for a while that's very good. That one automatically sorts your members into groups. I've used that one a lot. There's the Rob Spencer Dendrogram tool that will do that as well. SAP is an option. That's a tool I created. I actually don't like SAP to use SAP for that, only because when you pump a couple hundred members into it, it tends to draw this complicated tree, and then you have to go through the graphics and take a look at the tree rather than understand the grouping. So I actually find Chase Athlete's tool better for that purpose. When I have the subgroup, I then put that into SAP and I get an understanding of how the subgroup is connected to each other. But it's entirely up to you. I know plenty of people who take their whole project and put it through SAP, and they get a tree out of it, and then they can use that tree to figure out where the members belong, and then you just update that tree every time you get a new member and see where the new member falls. That's one way to do it. But there's a number of different options for running tools to compare a new member against the other members of your subgroups and figure out where they're closest to. That's, by the way, any of those tools is also a good way if you're taking over a project that either isn't well organized or should be reorganized, just to run every member through it and figure out the clusters that they should fall into. If they haven't done big Y testing, for instance, and you only know that there's a bunch of haplogroup R and a bunch of haplogroup I's or something, you could run an entire tool that way on the whole project and get it sorted for you pretty quickly. It's not always perfect, but it's always a good start. And then for STR only kits, you can also use any of the tools that estimate a detailed haplogroup and use those to organize your members as well. And of course, if you don't know where that is, hang on a second. If you don't know where that is, that link is there. So that has a whole bunch of tools. If you don't know YDNA tools, that has a list of a lot of them. And you can play with any one of them. And all of the ones that can estimate SNP haplogroup are fine in terms of figuring out what detailed, supposedly your subgroups, you know what detailed SNPs each one of them is likely connected to. And if you do, then any of those tools could help you do that as well. Now, if you go through any of that and you find out that the new member doesn't match any of your subgroups, you're probably either going to create a new subgroup for him, you're going to put him in a general category, or maybe you tell him that he's not likely to be part of your project. Maybe he should go join somebody else. Now, some of that open question, if they come in and they're not of your surname, especially, is are they really related to you or not? Even if they look like they're related, or if they not, are they related back before the time of the most recent common ancestor of that subgroup? Are they related within it? How do they fit? That's where the question of convergence comes in if they've only tested STRs, and that's why I have that as the last thing I'll talk about. But I'm moving through here quickly. If you're going to move members, you're going to do it in one of two ways. The usual way is back to the project admin member subgrouping. You're going to go into that function. You're going to probably manage ungrouped if that's where the person landed. You're going to click on that, or you're going to go over to the right-hand side that I've circled, and you're going to click the little move button to move people around within your existing subgroups. It's going to bring up this screen. You're going to go over. It's a little complicated. You find the member. You click on them on the left-hand side. You're going to click on the right-hand side to bring up where you're going to copy them to, and then you go over to the move button on the far left and you say move, and that's what takes them from one to another. That works. It's a little hard to do for multiple members though, because you have to go scanning through the screen. If you're going to move 2 or 3 people, it gets a little complicated. An easier way to do it is actually under the reports, genetic reports, and then you go into Y-DNA results. You get a page that looks like this. That's actually very similar to the DNA results, except it has a column that has the current subgroup that a member is in. You click on the subgroup for the member that you want to move, and it brings up that individual member. And then you click on the drop down, you find where you want it to go to, you click that, you click save. Don't forget to click save. You click save, and it'll move the member there too. Now, if you're moving multiple members, you can still only do them one at a time in this screen, but it's a little bit easier because you don't have to go scrolling through all the pages of their results to find them. You only have to go to one place. So I find that a little bit easier if I'm moving a couple of people around here, or if I'm moving 10 people around or whatever. But even if I'm only moving one, sometimes I'll use that because it's a little bit easier to get to. Last thing, is a brand new kit comes in, you don't know, it's not of the surname, let's say. Is this person convergent? So let's say they've tested Y37. Are they really a match or are they not? The only way to know for sure, and that's why I put it down here in red, the only way to know for sure is to have them upgrade to big Y, and hopefully you have other people that have upgraded to big Y, or else you have to do them as well in that subgroup. And then you can compare the two and see whether or not they're in the same part of the haplotree. But there's a few ways by STRs only that you can guess whether or not it's likely to be convergence or not. So first of all, obviously, the obvious one is that convergence is more likely at the lower amounts of testing than the above. If they've already tested to Y67 and Y111, the chances of conversion are not 0, but they're much, much smaller. Depending on what haplogroup they fall into, Y37 can get a lot of convergence or a little. And Y12 and Y25 have tons of convergence. Almost everybody is. I'll show you an example in a minute. Convergence is also more likely at higher genetic distances. If the new match matches your whole subgroup at, let's say 3 at Y37, it's more likely to be convergence than if they match a few people in the project at 0 and a few people at 1. So the closer the match is, the less likely it's likely to be convergence. It's not 0, especially at the levels like Y37, but it's less likely. You can see whether or not the match's off-modal signature is common in the subgroup, and I'll give you an example of that. It's easier to explain through example. Number 4 is that subgroups with rarer STR values are less likely to be affected by convergence. Now, to know if the values are rare, you'll have to get an allele frequency table, which is usually only built by haplogroup project admins. So you'll need to go to a haplogroup project admin and say, have you got one for the subgroup that I'm interested in? If they do, you can look up and see, for instance, that a particular subgroup has a rare set of values for certain STRs. The more rare their values, the less likely, by definition, other people in that whole haplogroup are likely to match them. So convergence will be less common, and that can tell you which of your subgroups are actually less likely to be affected by convergence than others. And you can use that when a new match comes in to say, well, they're matching a group that's not very likely that they match by convergence, so I'm pretty sure it's a real match, for instance. You can also see if the kit matches anybody else outside the subgroup at that level. If you have a brand new kit that comes into your project and they match your subgroup, but you look at their kit in their account and they actually also match hundreds of other people, it's likely it's a convergent match. If they don't match anybody else except your subgroup, then it's more likely it's probably real. It's not perfect, it doesn't tell you for sure, but it's more likely. You can also obviously also get the new kit's information and go through their backgrounds looking for connections. If that group came from the same place as the common ancestor of that subgroup, that's a good sign that it could be a real match. Now, one example, I took my own example because mine is an example of what I called number 1 and number 5 on the previous screen. If you were looking at my kit compared to a project at 12 markers, I have 18,020 matches at that level. That's because I'm R1b, I'm in the Western Atlantic modal haplotype. I have the most common values for all of R1b in that 12 set. And so I match nearly anybody who's tested. That would be a good sign that if I was comparing to any project that I'd be a convergent match. At 25, I'm actually 1,500 matches, so it comes way down, but not down far enough. At 37, I dropped to 26, and those are 26 real matches. So if I've tested to 37, and I come join your project, and you look at that and you say, well, there's 26 people, and all of them are in my project. All right, well, that's a pretty good sign that person is going to be a match to my project for real. At 67 markers, I only have 21, but that's because 5 of the people haven't upgraded that far. And the same thing at 111. I only matched 12 people. I think actually a couple of people dropped off, but that's also because a lot of them haven't upgraded. So all of these from 37 on up are actually real matches. The others are not. So that's a pretty good sign. If I was an admin and I looked at this, I'd say, okay, well, I'm not going to bother to try to analyze them at 12 or 25 if that's all they've tested to, or if that's all my subgroup has, right? You've got then an example of number 3. So here's a subgroup I have as an example. They have these STRs, and I've got 2 new joiners that have come in, and I take a look at their off-modal patterns, which means the STR values that have been colored here on the actual. I actually took this from the colorized screen. So in the first case, the first of my new joiners, I have a 12 off modal. The 30 isn't matched by anybody else in the project, but the 12 and the 16 and the 19 and the 36 and 37 actually match this little group up at the top of 2 or 3 testers there. That looks like, okay, they have off modals that are pretty close to my project. Maybe that person is actually a branch off the same people, off the same branch, the same ancestors as those people were above there. The second joiner, though, has completely different off modals. They don't match anybody else in my project existence. Now, that's not a definite sign. They might just be an older match that branched off early and has had more change than others. So I can't know for sure. But if I looked at those 2 and said which one is more likely to be convergence, it's clearly the second one, because the first one is more likely to have matched people in my project that they're connected to. So anyway, again, it's not a definite situation, but it's likely. That comes to the end of the presentation portion of this. I'm going to leave it open. I'm going to leave the recording open for anybody who wants to throw thoughts in of things that I didn't say, and I'll cover some of the questions on the chat. So I'll stop now, but if anybody wants to jump in first, please feel free. And nobody's saying a word. So on the chat, so there's one question from Susan that said, do you take the descendant info given by the participant as truth? No, I take it as represented as I'll say likely. And see, the problem is, it's traditional genealogy. None of it is truth, right? Even my favorite example is my great-grandfather's gravestone has the wrong date for his death. You'd think they'd get that right. They didn't. It has the wrong year on it, which it has the year before, which the only thing I can explain it is that they made the gravestone up before he died and he lasted into the next year and they didn't bother to change it, is the only explanation I have for it. But you would think that was accurate, and it's not. The same with most traditional genealogy information, even, to be honest, the same with, I'll say, both SNPs and STRs. Now, SNPs are almost always rock solid, but occasionally people do find that something that they had counted on with their very close genealogy, a SNP didn't occur when they thought it did, or somebody, there are some mistakes that can be made there for just things change in terms of the branching. So every information, I think, is open to some degree of suspicion, but I take the descendant info as a guideline. I go validate that from the DNA or see whether the DNA supports it. In most cases, the DNA will support, confirm, or correct their information, but it won't prove it. I tend not to say that DNA proves anything. It can be very supportive, can be strongly supportive, but there's always the chance that a connection isn't quite the way it is, especially with Y-DNA. When we know it can't name a specific ancestor, you could always be descendant from somebody's brother or cousin or uncle or whatever, rather than the person themselves that you think they are. So, I am always careful not to over either the traditional genealogy or the DNA, not over rely on it or overemphasize it.
But when you're grouping them, Dave, do you? That's really what
my groupings are. Yeah, my groupings tend to be far enough away that I take their genealogy and look at what I know about the group and see how it matches, and that's how I validate it or not. And I'll say, well, the person thinks that they descend from this person, but I know that person's in a completely different subgroup, and you match a different subgroup, so I know you can't be descended from the person you think you are, right? So at least not biologically. Now, that doesn't rule out that they might have been adopted, but for instance, my Vance subgroup, to have one Vance line and adopt somebody of a different Vance DNA line would be awfully suspicious. So I tend not to, yes, I will correct their genealogy if it doesn't match the DNA in that sense. But I have the luxury of doing that because my groups are far enough apart in time that the distinctions are clear. If you have a couple of subgroups that for some reason have very close Y-DNA, then you either have to have them all go up to big Y, or you have to do something else in order to make that obvious, right? You can't do it just based on STRs alone.
David, this is Ross Hadley. I have a question that I think is related to that, is how can we encourage both new members in our own projects and project admins of other projects to have people make it more obvious to bystanders or viewers which lines they descend from using the oldest known ancestor space? I mean, this is very confusing to look at projects that are not my own paternal line, but are ancestors of mine or ancestral lines, and try to figure out if anyone of my line is represented in the project. Right. When half of the people claim an ancestor in the 1300s, even though they're in groups that the DNA signatures don't match each other.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. It's a very good one. It's a complicated question. So, on the how do you use the earliest paternal ancestor field, right? I like the groups that put in the earliest known ancestor, and then sometimes like a son or two down, like a son and grandson. So they identify which branch they're on. That's a nice way of doing it. But you don't always have the luxury of space for that, but it's a nice way of doing it. It's the question of how do you sort them and then get them all to, I'll say, play nice, because you're right. Sometimes people affirm, they firmly believe they're of the descent of somebody else or something else and so on. All you can do is say, this is what the evidence says, right? This is what the DNA shows. It shows you're of this branch. I have, I joke a little bit about the royal line versus all the others. In Vance, actually, we have an equivalent. We have a line that comes from a minor nobility line in Scotland that everyone used to think they were descended from. And now that we're doing DNA, we see 18 different lines. Well, the truth is some of those are NPEs off of the royal line, or the equivalent. So their name is descended from there, even though their actual Y-DNA is not. But some people have a completely different origin, and so you have to explain that and say, look, this is what it shows, and you're connected to a lot of other people who carry the surname, just not the ancestors you thought you were. That's what we do this for, so to speak. I mean, I'm not going to say that we do it to ruin people's dreams, but the point being that that we do it in order to clarify and hopefully find out something about the origins we do have, right? So that's not a good answer to your question, though. The problem is you know, that gets into how do you convince people of something that they have had a firm belief for generations about, and that's a problem we've always had in genealogy, where we have to go, you know, prove an old myth wrong or something, right? And I don't know that there's an easy answer for that one.
Can I come in there, please? James Irvin. Ross, my answer to that would be I just ignore the most recent common ancestor. When I say ignore, I ignore it from the point of view of sorting into subgroups. I certainly value it and record it. But to me, the DNA evidence is dominant, and any genealogical evidence is secondary, and it's up to the individual to decide how secondary and how much he trusts it. I prefer not to make that subjective judgment. I base that on experience, because I find an awful lot of the most recent common ancestors are a bit suspicious. I'm not saying they're wrong, but I'm not convinced they're right. And when I communicate with the individuals, they say, "Oh yes, you know, Auntie Flo told me this, or I got it out of IGI or whatever." You find the background, or off ancestry. I find the background is a lot more shaky than had been would be apparent. Could I go back to your general point, Dave? Two points. I thought your introduction was very good. It was a very fresh look at a long-standing subject that we haven't tackled as a community nearly as robustly as I think we should have done. Two points came out that I think you, I won't say overlooked, but you didn't include. First of all, is this business of what is a match. Now, it wasn't relevant in the way you've tackled the subject. You've used tools and now Big Y as the main agents or the main tools to sort out projects. But going back 5 years before we had YDNA, oh God, it's more than that now, 7, 8 years before we had Big Y, we used to do it manually. And I think a lot of people are caught in this trap of the FTDNA cutoffs of their matches, particularly at 37 markers, which is where I like to work. I find anything less than 37 markers is too unreliable, and anything more, you're cutting out a lot of people that haven't tested that high. And cutting off at 4 by 37, I've found with the Big Y results is a very is the wrong word, is a rather rash cutoff. I've got matches, very good matches with Big Y at 6, 7, 8, even 9 markers different and at 37. Yes, they're rare, you have to be careful, but with Big Y, you can see that you do get matches at 6, 7, at 6 or 7 genetic distance of 6 or 7 at 37 markers. So I think a lot of the cases, the tests that end up in a no match situation or a no match category, in fact, can be put into a group. If they haven't done Big Y, then with a question mark, but Big Y may confirm that they are matches. The other point I'd like to make was in your fourth point, when you were looking at convergence, you were only looking at the STRs. I think the surname is the most important marker when one's looking at the convergence issue, and is very important to include. It cuts down the uncertainties quite a bit. It doesn't provide a definitive answer, of course, because we do have NPEs, but the surname is, to me, a most important consideration when you're thinking about convergence. Thank you.
Absolutely right. No, thank you, James. I appreciate those ads. Let me jump to a couple of the other questions on the presentation material. So, how often, from Jim, how often do you find that you have to reorganize your group subgroups? I do review my material over time. I've actually had to split a couple of subgroups after I found that people that I thought were closely related were in close, there were at least 2 examples of a subgroup that I created originally that turned out to be, after I upgraded them to Big Y, in close branches of the haplotree, but far enough back that they must have gotten there, or they most likely got their names, their surnames through different origins, just before the time of surnames. It's rare, it should be rare, hopefully, but they essentially converged on the surname, so to speak. And so I split them into subgroups, and that I did have to do over time. Except for that, I haven't reorganized my groups at all. The genealogies have been pretty solid in terms of, now I do obviously when someone comes in and they think they match one lineage, it turns out that they match another, but the subgroups themselves have remained pretty solid. Again, a little bit depending on the purpose of your project, you may find yourself reorganizing that. But on a general surname project, it ends up being fairly, at least I've found that they're pretty stable. And then Brandy asked, where will we be able to find this recording? I'm going to make it available in the social media platforms. I'll make it available any place else that makes sense. I'm going to find some places to put it out there. And hopefully as we get this series going, I'll have a repository for them that people can come and get to. So we have a place that people know it's there. But that's, I'll say I don't know for sure yet where the end goal is, but we'll get a place out that everybody can find and that you know it's going to be there repetitively. And as we add recordings, you can go there to find the new ones. All right, I'm going to stop recording now unless anybody has any last thoughts. Okay, thank you all, and we'll